Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's webinar Fireside Chat with Shape Security, the evolving role of the CISO. This morning, I'm delighted to introduce Larry Ventnor, who is the Vice President of Global Customer Success and Solution Engineering at Shape Security, now part of F5 Networks, who I will be chatting with today. Welcome, Larry. Pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Appreciate it. Really nice to be here. I'm excited for this.
And we got quite a name at the moment with the current weather conditions, fireside chat.
We were talking yesterday when we were prepping for this, we said that it should have been a poolside party and it should have been okay for us to like sit around with, less clothing on and margaritas. It would have been a better idea.
Absolutely. My name's Lisa Ventura and I'm the CEO and founder of the UK Cybersecurity Association. So before we begin today's fireside chat, I just have a couple of housekeeping announcements. We'll be taking questions at the end of the broadcast. So if you have something you'd like to ask Larry, please use the chat function to do so. And we're also going to be launching a few polls during the broadcast, which we hope you'll all take part in. And I'm going to release our first poll question now. Okay, and it is, do you believe that the velocity of digital fraud attacks will significantly differ in a post-COVID-19 world? And the responses are yes, no, and not sure. Okay, I'll close that one off now and move to our second poll, which is, sorry. Does your business have a unified view on the utility security measures like multi-factor authentication? Yes, no, or not sure? Great. Thank you all for answering that second poll. So Larry, are you experiencing a change in expectations for the role of the CISO? What aspects are you seeing?
Yeah, I think probably about 18 months ago, working with a broad variety of customers in a number of segments and a number of levels as well, we started noticing that the CISO was starting to traverse and actually cross over into non-traditional security sort of domains, so into fraud and even into business. And so, it was interesting for us. There was the emergence about 18 months ago of this notion of fusion teams, particularly in the United States in the financial sector, and then in retail as well more recently, where there isn't a segmentation or this clear role or demarcation anymore between a CISO's role, a fraud, a CRO in terms of a chief risk officer's role, and even a CMO in terms of a chief marketing officer. And so, I think what's starting to happen is that there's this revitalization of the CISO role, away from this notion of being the gatekeeper of what comes into an organization, but also taking it further and saying what benefits can we derive from being really good in security at the gate of an organization. So for sure, there is a revitalization of that role. We're seeing a change. It's a lot more inclusive, and so we like that change. We think it's a good thing because Lisa, one of the fallacies is that we own data, and we really don't, right? Like no organization owns it. Data runs across every function in an organization, and so anything that can help you see a more holistic and solution on data, no matter where you've compiled it from, is always going to be beneficial. And we're seeing CISOs move into those kind of like holistic multifunctional roles more often.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned diversity then as part of your answer, Larry. Are you seeing a lot more in terms of the role of the CISO being more in terms of gender diversity, neurodiversity, all those different aspects?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't, look, I mean, the gender story is one that haunts and continues to haunt, and so does, the discrepancies amongst, other lines of demarcation. But, we've seen a shift, towards a more balanced view, of CISOs and the profile of CISOs that are being served, by us. So there's definitely a movement towards that. I think that has increased a lot in the last 18 months as well. So I, and it's interesting. Like I keep using the 18-month thing, Lisa, but my feeling about it is that I only really started paying attention to, these kind of attributes about 18 months ago, and so, it's not like I'm talking about a 10-year history here, but in the last 18 months, for sure, we've seen traction in the other areas.
Lovely, thank you. Larry, have you seen your attack surface vectors and velocity change at all?
Yeah, I mean, velocity for sure. I'll take the easy one first. Velocity. If you look at, and again, just talking from our data, if you look at, the attack velocity, it has increased significantly. Sort of since I think the March timeframe is where we started seeing an uptick. And incidentally, it wasn't a gradual uptick. It actually spiked, and then it just, it kept on at almost like a new paradigm. It's not like we saw a linear increase. It just completely spiked, and it's stayed pretty steady. So the velocity is more. We're seeing it in terms of attack surfaces. 2019 was interesting, right? It was the year that people spent more time on mobile phones than what they did on television, or in front of the television. Maybe Netflix excluded now that COVID-19 happened. I don't know, but that whole paradigm shifted, and so the vectors have changed. More companies have moved rather radically to digitization. That mobile piece, we've always been waiting for it to actually surpass, television. That happened last year. And so, that brings its own velocity. So I think there's two new velocities. One is that shift that happened in terms of the attack surface and the attack source. And then also, the spike that came around from the COVID-19 sort of investment era. And that one in of itself, I'll just take a minute, is interesting. We noticed, for example, that one of the areas which has traditionally not been very well, if I just call it secured, has been healthcare. And, with billions and billions of dollars being flooded into the healthcare system, particularly, in the federal government in the United States, those properties were pretty unprotected. They were lagging in terms of, cyber defense in general, right? Like from security through fraud, through identity, and all of that. And so, you had this perfect storm going on where you had an essentially unprotected environment that was just given, billions of dollars of grants, and was super vulnerable. And so, we saw a quick snap too of the healthcare sector. So that was one area that we saw in particular, just a massive influx of velocity.
Yeah. So really interesting you talk about healthcare there, Larry, because that's certainly an area that I'm seeing it as well, particularly in the post-COVID-19 world. And there've been lots of great initiatives. There's the Cyber 19 Volunteers Initiative that exists through Lisa Forte and Daniel Card, that actively go out to help NHS trusts and hospitals and organisations be a lot more, cyber aware and cyber secure, and look at where they can really get their attack vector down to a more acceptable level. I'm certainly talking to the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford about their security and so on. So certainly healthcare is a huge thing at the moment.
Yeah.
So
and globally, right? Like
sorry?
And it's global. It's
Yeah.
the pandemic may not be treating everybody equally, but it's equal challenges all over the world to the hospital.
Yeah. Absolutely. Seems a long time ago from the WannaCry days that took out a lot of the NHS systems back in the day. Just before we move on, Larry, I'm going to launch our next poll question, which is: increasingly, businesses are realizing the value of creating hybrid security and fraud business units. And it'd be interesting to know, where does your business stand on this? Have you created a hybrid security fraud team, or are you considering creating one? Or do you have separate security and fraud teams but with close collaboration? Or do you have separate and siloed security and fraud teams? So I'll just give a few seconds for participants to answer that poll. Thank you. So moving on from the chat we just had about attack surface vectors and velocity change, what significant changes has this all precipitated in terms of security, Larry?
Again, right, like as I alluded to earlier, I have this 18-month view. I also have a very strong view, given the sort of approach that we've taken as a company. And so, my perspective is a little bit bent towards that, but I feel like, we're deeply reflective of what we're seeing in the market, and so it's a really good time for us. I think this notion of solving with a platform, has been around for a long time. And I think a platform has changed. A platform, you can talk about solving in a number of ways. A platform always sort of starts with this notion that you can cobble together 7 or 8 endpoint solutions, get outputs from all of them, put them into a workflow, and then have some really smart people look at it and make a determination about to trigger an event such as a mitigation event, or a review event, something like that. And so we see a lot of companies doing that, and it's a really traditional way. And here I can go back 10 or 15 years, but traditional in the sense that you have a composite platform that gives you a number of outcomes that you probably dump into a big old Splunk database and come out with some really, really good outcomes. But for us, a platform and the notion of a platform is changing. And for us, it's more along this line of exponential technologies and outcomes. And by that, what we talk about is how do you take an outcome of work that is being done and then use it to influence a different outcome at runtime? And then how do you go further and take that outcome and influence a further outcome and get the exponentiality of each of those pieces of work that are being done? So you pass your learnings, you pass your algorithms, you pass your machine learning through all of those phases. And what you really get is this high level idea of, if you look, if you think about redaction as opposed to accretion, instead of tying together 6 or 7 outcomes and having to do an assessment on them, imagine if you could reduce it and say, I'm not going to look at all of those. What I'm going to do is actually rely on one outcome to help influence the second, help influence the third and the fourth, and keep going like that. What you find is that, as our attack surfaces have gone up and as our vectors have increased, what you actually want to be doing is looking at less. You don't want to be looking at more, because there's so much more that you get lost in, in what your focal point is. And so, I think one of the big shifts that is happening, given the explosion in technologies, is this notion of using exponential outcomes to actually secure the outcome that you really want. If you'll permit, I'll tell you this quick little story. I was in Chennai in India, staying in a really nice hotel. It was a soft opening. And the architect of the building came and had a conversation with us. And, it was typically late, and I'd had a martini and a second martini, and he arrived for the third. And I was jet lagged and not doing well. But I sat and I listened to his story, and it was the topic was the notion of the differences between Western and Indian architecture. And the second notion that he mentioned was really, it was life-changing for me, because he said in Western architecture, we accrete, we build on top of. In Indian architecture, they redact it. So, they would look at a mountain and they'd say, how do we make a temple out of it? And so there had to be heightened precision in terms of the redaction. And so, I like this notion that as you go, you redact, you look at less, but with higher fidelity to secure the outcome that you want. And I think that's the way that, the technologies will lean in security and fraud and identity.
That's a really interesting concept, Larry, and I really like that, and I agree. I think that is going to be a lot of the way forward, and certainly we do tend to build on top of things when it comes to architecture, and that analogy really resonated, quite well with me. Thank you.
That's what I'm here for, really, is to get a resonance from you, Lisa.
Yeah.
So I can hang up now.
Thank you. So how is Shape Security assisting the information security community at this current time, particularly within the COVID-19 world at the moment?
Yeah. We were doing pre-COVID what we were doing, during COVID. So it's not like we've changed our operation. I think, as I alluded to it earlier, what we do, and however, there's this great confluence of a need right now, for a product like ours, for a capability like ours. And so, in continuation with that redaction story, right, like, there's some companies that represented here today, for example, in conversations with their senior execs, like, they'll say things like, well, it all starts with a true identity. I love hearing that, because it's true. I agree with that. For us, a secured identity is the ultimate outcome. And so, when you hear that, it always makes me feel great about what we're doing. Now, a lot of people will go, well, Shape is synthetic, detection and mitigation. And it's true. Our first 6 years, we went about deliberately after some of the largest brands on the planet, and developed the preeminent way of application security. And I can say that pretty confidently, because we've been doing it for a long time. Our first step was to essentially look at a brand or a site or a property and say, you have a lot of synthetic traffic that is actually skewing all of your metrics. And one of the capabilities that we can deliver on, is to take that synthetic traffic away for you. And we don't always do that. Like, what we do, though, is that we make attacker economics really, really ineffective, and they eventually do go away. That's always been our strong story. And so you go, well, how does that help identity? And so here's the magic that happened for us about 2 years ago, when we started looking at what was happening in our data. There was this moment. I was actually in California for it. There was this moment when we looked at the data that came out. So essentially, if I just use whole numbers, right? Like if there was 100% of traffic coming to a site, in retail, typically 97% of that is just nonsense. It's just machine generated, stuff that is hammering your sites and, costing you more money. And so that 3% that was left, we actually took that and we ran, our machine learning and AI over that again, and took a harder look at it. And what we were able to see was that there was this thin sliver of what we would have called machine, attack, but it wasn't machine attack. It had different sort of characteristics to it, but enough of them were similar that we could look at those signals and go, there's something going on here. And so what we were able to see is this, machine-like activity from a human. And, we scrutinized that and we took that away. And then we went one step further and we thought, well, what if instead of protecting just endpoints like you do in a good security solution, you actually deploy across the user journey? What would we see there? So now you're down to sort of 3%. We had a look at those user journeys with the JavaScript that we would actually blanket over those user journeys. And when we looked at that, we answered the second question, right? The first one being, are you human? The second one being, are you good human or bad human? And what we were able to see is beyond existing controls of current fraud architecture, we were able to see more fraud than what existing controls were. And we were like, God, that's kind of interesting. And so, now we were able to say with alarming clarity whether you were good or bad human. And then the last step for us was to say, well, if you're good, are you say who you really are? And, we could actually, with clarity, start providing what we call a legitimized identity. And so, that in a sense is this, exponential outcome that I'm talking about. So, while we reduced bots and then we had humans left, and then we went, well, could we do something with humans with what's left in the redacted set? And then we went one step further and we said, well, once we know that they're actually who they are, can we make sure that they stay that way? And so what our customers started doing, it'll surprise anybody that is dialed in today thinking that the story was, only synthetic mitigation. It'll be surprising for them to say, or to hear rather, that we have customers that are so trusted of our legitimized identities, or legitimized user stats, that they will leave sessions open up to 3 months and never re-challenge that user, in that 3-month period. Now, why is that important? It's important because you actually start seeing, in the COVID world in particular, the conversion of a legitimized user has gone up nearly 3 times. So, instead of you pushing them through a guest checkout because you don't know who they are or stepping them up, like, you just ping them into that property and they convert at a higher rate. And so get this, like redaction of action, but, an increase in revenue. So that's what we've been doing. And, that story resonates a lot with companies, that have been working on us with us for several years.
Just picking up on a couple of things you said there, Larry, do you think that the information security community is now coming together in a better way in the COVID-19 world? Certainly from my previous experience, prior to this year, I did see a lot of kind of silos or different groups, cliques that were doing kind of their own thing, but not really interacting or sharing that across the board. But what's been really heartening this year from my experience is that I've seen the community, really come together. Is that something that you've also experienced?
Yeah, completely. So not only would I agree with you, but I also think that what's starting to happen is that CISOs are starting to pull into their conversations adjacent capabilities, such as fraud teams, such as identity teams, such as business teams, right? Like they're starting to look at, how do you could make the argument that a step up is actually a failure of security, right? Given this continuity of how we operate, and so so that conversation of like, I'm just a gatekeeper has gone away, right? Like they're deeper into business, they're deeper into marketing metrics and that kind of stuff. And so, I think there's a tightening of the community and there's an elevation, of the role itself, that is starting to happen as well.
Thank you, Larry. That was a really insightful discussion and a lot of takeaways there for me, especially around the attack vector and how things have really grown and developed this year in the post-COVID-19 world. Before I take a few questions from the audience, I'm going to launch our final poll for today, which is, what do you think are the long-term effects of the current pandemic to businesses? So for your business, which is your top priority? Is it security, reducing fraud, business growth, or customer experience, or a combination of any of the above? And I'm just going to give a few seconds for the audience to answer that poll. Okay. That's lovely. Thank you, everyone. So, Larry, we've had a few questions that have come in from our audience today. And the first one is that security, customer experience, and revenue growth don't have to be mutually exclusive priorities for your business. So how can we better enable this cross-functional dialogue?
So I think necessity is actually pushing that conversation. I wish I had something more tactical to actually say, like, go find your CRO and go find your CMO and go find your chief data officer and get them in a room and start talking, which I'd love you all to go do. I think necessity is starting to, really drive this fusion. And so, I'm not sure that I have a quick answer in terms of how you start having those conversations. But I will tell you the way that that when I think about global sales engineers today, and I'll make it about us again, because I think it answers the question in a roundabout way at least. But when I think about our SEs going into a conversation today with a client or a prospect, we don't go in anymore and go, hey, we're here to tell you a story about synthetic detection mitigation, or a story about fraud, or a story about identity. We go in and we literally sit down in the room and go, what is the single greatest metric that everybody in this room agrees on? And if the room says, well, we need to get our fraud numbers down, we talk about that. And our story is, one that goes, well, you can reduce your fraud numbers drastically through following our redactive process. If the metric is, we need to grow our online user base, we can have that conversation about how we can help do that. And so, I think you need to talk more broadly. I think you need to share common metrics across those disciplines. I think you need to agree, on the ranking of those metrics as well, and you all need to go after it. If we ask at the organizational level, what is your single largest or your single biggest metric that you concern yourself, we will get 3, 4, 5 different answers. But if you put those into a room together and you say, what is the one that you all agree on? That's what you want exponential technologies to help you achieve. And so I think that's how you've got to start having those conversations. And that's how we approach customers these days, is what is the single big outcome that you want to change? And we'll show you how we get there.
Thank you, Larry. Another question that we've received is, whether you face any particular challenges with your budget, and whether revenue and ROI measure would help in securing additional or more budget.
I'm assuming that you're saying if I was a CISO, right?
Yeah.
Like that's
Yeah.
how would I be experiencing it? Yeah. So, I'll give you a real example. We have a bank in the northeastern part of Canada that is a customer of ours, we actually started clearly with the CISO there, we showed efficacy in terms of synthetic detection and mitigation. We had grown a really good relationship with that person, and then we started talking to them about our fraud capabilities and about our identity capabilities. The second or third time that we pitched, he was like, "Look, I get it, but I can't make these decisions for you, right? So here's what I'm going to do: is I'm going to put everybody in a room, and we're going to have a conversation about it." He did that, and we got into that room and we had a conversation about what we could do with identity, how we could help with fraud, all as a result of like really, really good, synthetic detection mitigation. And so, that team started working with us. And when that team got together and saw what we could do, they approached, the CEO for budget. And so, you had this I want to say weird, but I think it's going to become more prevalent, right? You had this novel moment, at least for us, where you had business teams funding security operations, and you had fraud teams funding security operations, and because they were sharing in the outcome, right? And so, one of the things that that we encourage with the CISO is you may not know how to solve human fraud, right? Like you may not know how to work with identity, and you may not know how to increase revenue because of your role, but go have those conversations. Because as the role changes and as the vitality of the CISO changes, they're going to have to swim across those lanes. And so we're seeing that a lot. It's becoming, honestly, like I wanted to say I'm an old man, but I'm not really. But if I had a career choice again, and I think about where the CISO role is evolving to, and how vital it can be, and how interesting and exciting it can be over the next decade, it's definitely where I'd want to be going.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Larry. Another question that we've received is around whether you prefer to keep security solutions in-house or look to outsource these to trusted solution partners with combined network intelligence.
Yeah. Boy, 2 years ago, I would have said to you that we prefer to put a device behind your firewall. Today, we deploy virtually in any environment, in any geography. I remember with the company that I was at prior to this, we were working with a bank in London, and it was such a novel idea for them to open up an API to an external vendor that it took them 6 weeks to get permission to do it. By the way, and then another 4 weeks to do it, because like nobody believed that it could get done. And it was hosted by somebody else, and it was just a cluster, right? But today that thinking has changed, and that was 3 years ago. So I think I'm going to answer that question in two levels, right? Like one is I think you go to the place where the outcome that you want is made available to you in the quickest way with the most integrity. And I don't think it necessarily matters where that's hosted or where it's housed. I think that's the one thing that I would say. I think the second thing that I would say is, I'll go back to the opening story about the platform, right? Like, step away from composite platforms that provide 9, 10, 12 outcomes that you've got to weight solutions with. Walk away from, probabilistic and more towards deterministic, because you've got to stop looking at the deluge of data that is coming at you and be trusting of something that actually allows you to look at less but with greater integrity and with more fidelity. So I don't know, I hope that answers that question. It's one that is worthy of a pool party and not a fireside chat.
Thank you, Larry. Final question that we've received from the audience today is, traditionally, the impact of automated attacks are not usually correlated with fraud impacts. So how do your teams discover the relationships between automated attacks and fraud?
Yeah, well, I hope we ever put that question out. I can get time with individually. Because no, I mean, we see, you know, the scale of automated attacks is, you know, where the concern happens, right? Like, so, you know, we see that around about 2% of, you know, automation converts into fraud, you know, and, you know, a lot of people go, well, that's not a lot. But when you are using automation, you know, at a level of billions of transactions daily, it is a lot. You know, and so I agree. There's not a great correlation between, you know, between synthetic attack and fraudulent activity. You know, but we know that there's a 2% correlation, and that 2% correlation converts to a ton, you know, of access, right, and a ton of corrupted accounts, etc. And we know that, right, which is why we evolved our fraud solution to look at that with greater clarity, and why we evolved the identity solution to secure against that too. So, you know, I can't disagree with it, you know, with a correlation. It's low, it's 2%. But in terms of, you know, what does that 2% mean? Well, you know, I mean, you know how many accounts you have, take 2% of that and wonder what the impact is after a sustained attack. By the way, sometimes we see hundreds of millions of, you know, of probes over a 9-month period. Like, you know, that's a lot of 2%. So, you know, I'd love to have that conversation. That's more than a pool party conversation. That's a pool party and a couple of margaritas conversation.
Absolutely. And we've actually just had one last question come in from one of our audience members, which is, an organization has a lot of different systems that come with their own security challenges. So how do you then apply security of these systems in the reductive process that you mentioned?
Lord, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Can you say it again to me? Let me just try and get my head around it.
Yeah. An organization has a lot of different systems that come with its own security challenges. So how do you then apply security of these systems in the redacted process that you had mentioned?
Okay. You know, I'm going to answer that more or less from our sales cycle, you know, from the perspective of how we approach a sales cycle. We never go into an account where we're not challenged. You know, a lot of those accounts obviously start with security because it's where we grew what we do from. We are constantly challenged in those accounts, you know, when it comes to either a displacement or, you know, a parallel effort, right? And invariably, when we're involved in the security aspect of that, you know, we will see that, you know, our results actually are sufficient enough to have several systems shut down. And so the reliability of our system becomes something that, you know, that the customer will accept and adopt. And what's, I think, you know, this ties into, I think, the question as well as the notion of these exponential technologies, right? And that is that if we're up against an incumbent, you know, what you don't get from that incumbent is our follow-on exponentialities. You know, so we show, you know, efficacy against our competitors in the security area. Those will eventually go away. Some people run them in parallel for a while. You know, in the fraud area that we operate in, yeah, we go up against, you know, massive incumbents. You know, I've worked for a couple of them, and they're good technologies. What we prove out over time, though, is that we see more fraud than what your current controls are, and they're part of those incumbents in the fraud area. And so those will get reduced as well. Will they go away? No, because I don't ever think a customer is going to rely on a single capability to solve fraud. It's just not in our nature to do that. We're not that trusting. And then it's the same thing for identity, right? Like we bat up against several incumbents around identity that have got fantastic solutions. But we gravitate towards this idea of, we're all under pressure, right? And so your false positive rate is something that you look at all the time because, I've only got 20 people that can only review 400 transactions a day, right? And so you're constantly in this battle of, of trying to solve what you're looking at against the head count that you have, against the review rate, against your false positives. And our mission is to just over time, like redact. And as we redact, if you choose to keep other systems in place, then that's your choice as well. Our hope is, our mission is, is to make it easier, is to make you look at less, is to be more deterministic for you, right? Like that's why we provide security as a service. So it's a beautiful question, and I think the only way that I can answer it is almost what I said earlier, and that is, continue looking for the best outcome. If an outcome can, one, reduce your costs, and two, increase your revenue, and keep you secure, and keep your fraud numbers down, then go with that one. But never trust it fully, because you always want to balance it a little bit. My hope is with time, here's a story that, or rather a statement. One of our founders says that the way that we do synthetic redaction and fraud today and identity today is going to look really cute in about 3 years' time. And I think that's true, right? I think it'll all change, and I think this is part of that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time today, Larry, and the discussion. It's been really insightful, and I've really enjoyed talking to you. This webinar will be available. We have recorded it. We did have another question about whether it was recorded, so we will be able to share it. Thank you so much again, Larry, and to everybody for attending today. Hope you all enjoy your day, and thank you very much again. Thanks, everyone.